Hi, welcome to this context lesson for the Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. All the images used in this PowerPoint are of the public domain. We're going to be looking at 3 key points of information. We're going to be looking at the poet, we're going to be looking at the Crimean War, and we're going to be looking at the Battle of Balaclava, which was one of the main battles in this war. Okay, we'll start off with Alfred Tennyson. He was a poet laureate, so it was his job to write poems that were based on events that were going on at the time. Tennyson wrote a lot of patriotic poems during the Crimean War, sometimes under a pseudonym, which showed his utmost support for the British Army and what they were doing for their country. He thought that the charge of the Light Brigade showed courage, not stupidity. He felt it was a testament to show how strong and brave the British Army were. Their willingness to follow orders was what made Britain stronger. He wrote the poem in 2 minutes. It's actually a response to a series of news articles about the incident. He didn't initially publish this under his own name. As mentioned above, he used a pseudonym of A.T. His reason for this was that because he was a poet laureate at the time, he didn't feel the style of the poem was written in a suitable manner. Okay, now we move on to the Crimean War. This was a war that was started to stop Russia from making a move into the diminishing Ottoman Empire. Most of it revolved around religion erasure, but it was mostly seen as Russia trying to territory grab. The British public had a lot of issues with the war itself, especially Britain's involvement. There was a considerable lack of coverage of it, and actual death numbers and the status of the soldiers were being withheld from the public eye. Their biggest issue was that it took ages for the Battle of Balaclava to be discussed. People knew it was happening and they knew that British troops were involved, but there was nothing being reported on it. So as opposed to the Second World War, where there was quite a lot of media coverage, the Crimean War didn't have as much media coverage. Eventually, rioting broke out in London and the Tory government passed a bill to have a full investigation of the war completed. They wanted a full count-up of British troops to actually be able to tell what the official death count was. The Prime Minister actually resigned after this due to a vote of no confidence. In the aftermath, Russia was defeated. A statement was released suggesting that Russia felt as though the war proved that First World countries had superior weaponry and firepower. In the end, the Allied forces lost over 200,000 troops to wounds, deaths and other causes that meant they couldn't fight, not that they'd all died. And the Russian army lost over 500,000. Okay, now we'll go on to the charge mentioned in the poem. This poem talks about a real-life event made by a mounted cavalry unit, which is a unit on horseback, during the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War. Orders were misunderstood when Captain Nolan carried a verbal message to Lord Lucian, who was the man in charge of the Light Brigade, for them to attack the guns. The actual order from above was to cut off a retreating Russian force and to prevent them from harrying British guns that were being prepared for resupply, something which a close combat unit like the Light Brigade was actually suited for. Due to the misinformation, they ended up attacking Russian cannons instead, something they were absolutely not suited for. Despite the obvious error in orders, they still charged and they were very much decimated. Captain Nolan was killed during the charge, so no one really knows what happens when he was carrying the orders. Perhaps he's the man Tennyson refers to when he says that someone had blundered. Okay, so what's left? Try to revise these 3 key points. For every quote that you look at, try to create a sentence that includes one of these points of information. Try to further your research on these 3 topics: the poet himself, the Crimean War, because as we know, I talked a lot about the British involvement in the war due to the charge of the Light Brigade, but there was a lot of other things going on in the Crimean War at the time. And also, research more on the charge of the Light Brigade for the precise details. Now that you know these points of information, good luck.